There's something strange in the air. It feels like the whole world is going to China this month. The French president and the European Commission president went last week. The German foreign minister was there this week. The Australian prime minister said he's just waiting for an invitation to go. But nobody is as enthusiastic about visiting China than Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil. Lula's trip to China this week made headline news everywhere in the world. It was as though he wanted to make sure everyone knew he was there. China was good for Lula during his first term. Bilateral trade increased by 20 times, and China replaced the United States as Brazil's largest trading partner. This helped Brazil become the 8th largest economy in the world and helped pay for Lula's ambitious welfare programs that lifted 20 million Brazilians out of poverty. As Lula embarks on his historic second term, he's looking to China once again. But this time, Lula needs China to do more than buy soybeans and iron ore. This time, he needs his old friend to help him transform the Brazilian economy. Lula wants BYD, the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, to take over the operations of Ford Motors that has decided to pull the plug on Brazil after 100 years. On his China trip, Lula signed 15 memoranda of understanding with China around telecommunications, digital developments, and satellite monitoring. Apparently even entered into an agreement with Huawei, the Chinese firm sanctioned by the US, to collaborate on semiconductor development, cybersecurity, and 5G. Can China deliver for Lula again? What did Lula mean when he said Brazil is back? What does Lula's return to power mean for the fight between the unipolar world order and the multipolar one? Lula preserved the reforms of his predecessors and pushed through new ones. Will Brazil become less or even more polarized under his watch? Hello everyone, I'm in Washington DC today, on the sideline of the IMF World Bank Spring Meeting. I'm at an event organized by XP, which is the biggest Brazilian broker. And I'm joined today, happily by 3 of the most thoughtful experts about everything Brazil, Brazilian economy, Brazilian politics, Brazil everything, basically. And first of all, Kyle Magali. Kyle is the chief economist for XP. And then, of course, Fernanda Genta, who is the chief economist for XP Asset Management. Of course, last but certainly not least, Junia, who is the political analyst for XP. Especially given, the election, what's going on right now in Brazil right now, I sort of feel like the whole political, climate environment is probably more important than usual. Even though for Brazil, especially, I think politics has always been as important as economics to understand where we're going now. So, thank you guys for joining me today. I woke up this morning, I was looking at all the major newspapers around the world, and every single one carried the story on their front page. I mean, this clearly, and I think, to some extent, I think it was a well-orchestrated trip, right? I don't think the DW in Germany decided to basically make this a big story if it weren't for the fact that Lula and the people around him decided that they want to make a big story out of this. Right? I mean, Lula has been saying a lot of quotable things about this trip. He just got to China. He's saying all sorts of things are getting quoted everywhere, and so on and so forth. Lula's very first trip to China was associated with the rise of Brazil in the mid-2000s, right? I mean, when Brazil became the darling for investors around the world, and people sort of felt that Lula was breathing new life into the Brazilian economy, and that was to a great extent associated with his basically partnership with China. And I've always said he was very lucky because as soon as he became president, the Chinese decided they wanted to consume more protein, right? Because the thing is, when people get richer, the first thing they want to do, even before they can afford to buy a car, they want to eat better. They want to eat more meat. If you want to basically eat more pork, like the Chinese eat a lot of pork, you need basically, things to basically feed the pigs with. Of course, that was when soybean prices went through the roof, and Brazil being one of the largest, soybean exporters in the world, caught that right. So I guess for Lula, when he's thinking about, how he's going to repeat the success of his first time as president, the second time, maybe he's thinking, maybe China's going to do the magic for him once again. So the question is, first of all, Kyle, let's start with you. I mean, just out of curiosity, so Lula seems to be very excited about this trip to China. Do you think the Brazilians, back home are as excited about this trip basically to China for him?
Yeah, so I think that you put correctly, like China played a very important role for Brazil in the mid 2000s and is still playing a very important role, not only on agriculture, as you mentioned, but also in iron ore, even in oil. Brazil is a diversified country in terms of commodities, and so it maybe is the country that benefits the most when China is doing well. Lula knows that, and so the strip is important in geopolitical terms, but also important in economic terms. So he's talking about different issues like trading directly with China without using the dollar, but using BRL and the renminbi. So there are many important issues that if he managed to settle right now, it may help his administration going forward. So if we have an environment with interest rates in the US, in Europe, stabilize and starts to go down, and commodity prices remain elevated, it's very difficult, for instance, to see the real losing value and Brazilian exports coming down. So in that sense, going to China is key for the success of Brazilian economy going forward.
Let's come to you, because I'm trying to understand this trip for Lula. To what extent, he was just in Washington D.C., in February, where he met with basically Biden, and then people were, pleasantly surprised by the warmth he was received, especially given Bolsonaro, his predecessor, had a very cold relationship with Biden. So from that point of view, he came home, Lula came home as having brought home, better relationship with the U.S. Now he's setting off to China, right? Now, so from that point of view, I thought the most important thing he said this morning, which really took me aback when I thought about this, was the fact he said, wow, listen, Brazil has now finally decided to come out of international isolation, that Brazil is back in business, that we're going to become a global player once again. So he's talking about propelling Brazil back on the global stage to become a major player after, of course, the relative isolation of Bolsonaro, who's much more focused on Brazil per se. But do you think this message of Brazil becoming a global player once again, do you think that's a message that will resonate with basically Brazilians at home, those people who voted for him? Or do you think that there's something more to this?
I think that directly it's not his voters' main concern to bring Brazil back to a global player again, but it's something that could help in Brazil's image in one side for recovering people's self-esteem, and in another side it could bring more business. So I think that his goal, after all, is that, bringing more business. That means Brazil will be able to grow more, that will bring more investments, that's what he really wants. I think for the image is also important. If you remember on Lula's first terms, I think on his second term, he was negotiating Iran's nuclear program. So he thinks that that is really important for the country's image to be a global player that opens opportunities, that opens the doors for more investments, for more negotiations. Now what he wants to do in China is bring Brazil back to that role. He wants Brazil to be a protagonist on the environmental agenda, on the green agenda again. And also he aims to be able to mediate Russia and Ukrainian conflict.
You're right. I mean, Lula understands the challenges that Brazil faces at home. And in some sense, to become an ambassador for Brazil, to basically lift the spirit of Brazilians, but also put the Brazilians back into the basically play in terms of attracting international businesses, capital, and so on and so forth. In some sense, that really ought to be the #1 job for the president of any country. I mean, what do you think about that, Fernando? To what extent do you think this will translate into actual, results, rather than you think of this just basically being primarily PR?
I'm a little bit more skeptical about the results of this trip. As Juna just said, one of the targets is to solve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and this is so...
To mediate, not solve.
To mediate.
I think he's not that ambitious.
David, we are in a split society nowadays in Brazil. Lula just won a really tough election. We have lots of problems to solve there. So I believe that in practical terms, I'm not that optimistic about the results of the trip, being really honest to you.
Yeah.
And another thing that may be important to mention is that I mean, Lula is putting this trip, as he did when he went to Argentina and here to DC, that that Brazil is back on the game, is opening his arms again to global economy. But Bolsonaro also came to the U.S. a couple of times, and he was a very good friend with the president of the United States at that time, which was Trump. He flew to China a couple of times. He met with Xi Jinping as well. So there's also a bit of marketing on that. But in any event, regardless the president, China is important for Brazil. So being close to China is relevant. And Brazil, interestingly enough, regardless if it was Lula, Bolsonaro, or Temer, or Dilma, he always plays this, like there was always this big tension between China and the U.S. China and the U.S. are the two most important countries for Brazil, maybe for any country in the world, but especially for Brazil. So, and Brazil always played well on the two sides. They were well with the U.S., well with China. And so, in this sense, I agree with Fernando. I don't think that Lula will be able to, change the role of the U.S. dollars in global transactions. I don't think that Lula will be able to change anything in the war between Ukraine and Russia. But for Brazil, it's important to have to be in good terms with the most important players. I think that Bolsonaro did it, and I think that Lula is doing the same.
And just to add, I believe that Lula is really a pragmatic guy, but his party itself prefers a lot China than United States.
Yeah, but I think there is a difference between what Bolsonaro did regarding China and what Lula is doing. I mean, of course, Bolsonaro went there a few times, but we had his foreign minister saying weird things about China, almost bringing a diplomatic conflict between the two countries. So Lula is more aware that we need to treat well our first commercial partner. He wants to make it a big deal. So he wants to show that we need to be closer than we were before. And that, I think, it could bring concrete results when we talk about investments. He's signing 20 business contracts now with China. He's visiting China's largest firm, which is Huawei. So I think it has more meaning than what Bolsonaro did, because Bolsonaro actually didn't make it a big thing. The international relationship for Bolsonaro was something that he didn't really spend a lot of time and energy on.
Maybe less marketing, in my point of view, but it's a kind of a disagreement.
We talked about basically interest rates being very high, right? I mean, 13.75% is pretty remarkable that Brazil is actually growing at all. Because, I mean, when you have like 13.75%, people think, well, you're about to go into a depression because all the debt, servicing, and then nobody wants to basically borrow money because nobody can afford to borrow money at 13.75%. That's a base rate, which means anybody basically wanted to invest anything, probably borrowing at, basically 20%. Is that also a sign that Brazilian economy is doing better than people think? That it can actually cope with the high interest rates and still grow? So that in itself is telling you that, the currency is strong and the country is still growing. Maybe it is telling us that the reforms of the past few years under Bolsonaro did come through in a big way. And certainly, post-COVID, I think a lot of people were caught by surprise by just how strong the Brazilian economy has been.
Yeah, no, definitely Brazil, especially last year, was a star in terms of growth comparing to the rest of the world, and even compared with what people were forecasting in the beginning of the year. So, and I think that is a combination of two things. One is those structural changes that are starting to pay off, and that we already mentioned here. And the other is those two cyclical issues. One is exiting COVID. So we did well in terms of vaccination. It was fast, and then after that we had like a couple of quarters where people were quite excited and consuming and traveling regardless the prices or any condition. And the other reason was that government, both Bolsonaro and then now the signing from Lula, inject a lot of money in the economy, continue to inject a lot of money in the economy. And I give you an example. The main cash transfer program for the poor that we have, Bolsa Familia, its budget was multiplied by what, 5, 6 times?
6 times.
In a matter of 1 year.
From 0.3 of GDP to 1.7 of GDP.
No, it is massive, massive. Bolsonaro did it and Lula kept it, even increasing a bit. So, and this is a type of money that you put in the economy, and the marginal proportion of consumption from the people that receive those money is massive. So we are seeing this effect, but eventually you're going to have to pay for that. And the way that this government decided to pay is not by reducing some expenditures, but increasing the tax burden on companies. So this, and exactly at the same time that the central bank, that the tight monetary policy is starting to bite. So we are a bit more skeptical about growth in this year and next year because of those two combined things. We are doing a fiscal consolidation on taxes that puts a weight on the productive sector, and at the same time interest rates are extremely high and probably continue to be high for at least 5 or 6 months before it starts to gradually come down. So, but I mean, it's a period of adjustment that the economy has to go through, and then the discussion and the uncertainty on that front will be on the political field again. So how Lula and the rest of his team will react when seeing that growth is actually decelerating because of those adjustments.
We had a very we were lucky considering commodity prices and the war. What brought us talking about oil prices with Petrobras, it helped a lot to pay the bills, the transfers till now. We are definitely in a new momentum here. The bill is there. Brazil, I believe that's one of the only countries in the world where COVID expenditures became permanent, and that will be also a big challenge. But talking about growth, of course, we have the reforms, we have the reopening process, but Brazil won lottery talking about commodity prices after the war.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, which is that if you think about this, right? I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war, right? It was a huge shock to the global economy, right? Especially if you're commodity importers, right? You were just destroyed. Right, I mean, Europe was a good example. That's why Europe was lucky; it didn't go into a recession already last year. But obviously, there's no doubt one of the big winners, okay, of the war was Brazil, because, like, because of the sanctions on Russian, commodity exports, commodity prices went up, which was a massive terms of trade, basically positive shock for Brazil. But what's interesting, of course, in coming to this year, you say, okay, fine. So that effect was going to basically, lessen. But then China basically lifted the COVID restrictions, and the Chinese growth is picking up, and you're seeing another round of appreciation of commodity prices. So maybe in that sense, I think Brazil is a bit lucky. Okay, I think for very different reasons, especially for a large, close economy, right? These international factors, which it has zero control over, so far seems to be playing to its favor. Brazil having to choose between China and the U.S., right? I think obviously, we have a great example right now, which is, of course, the future, the destiny of what happened to the Ford Brazil, right? Ford had been in Brazil for 100 years. They invested aggressively in Brazil because they saw Brazil as being the biggest market in Latin America. They thought this was going to be like a layup, okay, in terms of basically making Brazil the crown jewel of their manufacturing capabilities to supply the entire Latin American market. But after 10 years, okay, they decided to close shop. I don't remind you, in 2021, basically Ford closed down all their factories in Brazil and decided to get out altogether. I mean, in fact, they claimed that, even before COVID came along, they had lost $7 billion, basically making cars in Brazil from 2013 until 2020. And, obviously 5,000 people were laid off. It created a lot of basically controversies in Brazil. People say, wow, what happened? Now, of course, this morning I was just reading that BYD, which is the biggest basically car manufacturer in China, now says, well, they're interested in basically, taking over the factories that, that Ford just basically closed down in Bahia. Why did Ford fail in Brazil? Okay, and then the fact that they fail, what does it say about Brazilian manufacturing, about Brazilian bureaucracy, about Brazilian labor productivity? And is this something that the Chinese are going to be more predisposed to turn around? It's because I think that's what it really comes down to. It's about business models. The US came and tried, failed, got out. The question is, are the Chinese going to come in, fail, and also get out? Or that the Chinese can make more of it? And I think that's what it's going to come down to, because I think this is the real fight over the soul for, the global south, is that which country can offer more, the US or China? What do you think?
Ford doesn't want to stay in Brazil, they are going away, but the Chinese companies are coming and they will accept anything to be in Brazil because politically it will be important. So let's try to step back and see how, say, the manufacturing sector in Brazil has been doing in the last, say, 50 years. What we've been seeing is that we've been losing ground for services and other activities, because doing business in Brazil is really challenging. We have problems in red tapes, tax system is quite complex, infrastructure is difficult. The tax system, as I mentioned before, is a big mess. So for instance, you mentioned the plant that Ford had in Bahia, which is a state in the northeast, far from the consumption market. They should be producing closer to the consumption market, but the problem is that they have tax incentives there, and the infrastructure to take your cars from Bahia to São Paulo is difficult. So it's not easy to do business in Brazil, especially to do production in Brazil. So we saw throughout the years many companies coming and going. Ford is a big example, but I remember other car makers, Chinese car makers, that came to Brazil, stood for a while and left. Not because the government was this or that, but because, again, doing business in Brazil is complicated. So in this sense, more important than deciding if you're going to align with China or align with the US should be to focus on domestic reforms. Government has one very good tax reform. The President Lula has a good tax reform that, by the way, is the same tax reform that we've been discussing in Brazil for a couple of years now. And if we approve that tax reform, it could be an important step up in this trend. Other reforms that we're doing in the past, so we did labor reform, we did social security reform, we changed the market, the framework for investment in some key sectors like railways, like sewage and water. So is this government change those reforms, or they are going to step up those reforms? This is more important in my view and obviously another key factor that I'm forgetting to mention, but it's even more important than all this, education. So capital, human capital, and so on. So this is the reason why maybe not, we've been seeing throughout the years many multinational companies coming to Brazil and then deciding to leave. So I think that it's a matter of structural reforms rather than foreign policy.
Just if I might add here, Ford left Brazil because it made no profits there without incentives, as Caio said. And the government decided not to give more incentives, and it's a company that was there in around 100 years with no profits without incentives. I doubt that any car maker in Brazil will have profits. So, or we have a deal that, okay, you can come because you have more incentives, the game has changed and then we'll come back to give incentives, or you have this geopolitical thing, trying on the bargain between the two big countries, and I believe that this might reflect the relationship.
Lula is pragmatic enough not to choose between the United States or China. I think he will always be trying to be friends with both, but in this kind of position, he goes to China, he makes a big event out of it so that he can tease the United States a bit. So see, what can you do for me? China is receiving me with a red carpet. We are signing contracts. So what do you have for me? I think that he's always going to play friends with both. And Caio mentioned a key reform that we're going to start discussing now in Brazil, that is the tax reform. I think that it has the potential to change a lot the way companies see Brazil. It's going to be, the main issue in the reform is creating a VAT, a simple tax for consumption. It may change our bureaucracy, our inefficiency on taxes. So that may clean the ground a bit for that. So he's doing his job. It's safe to say that very likely for Brazil to approve this tax reform this year.
I mean, I'm personally a huge fan of, basically this tax reform, because I see what happened in India. Under Modi, they introduced the VAT tax reform, and the tax collection has gone through the roof. And then but most importantly, the efficiency of tax collection has improved. It's more transparency. That also basically reduced the underground economy. Okay, so it's a lot of basically, benefits. Ironically, when you're talking about reform, it's always easier for parties on the left to do serious reform than parties on the right. Because parties on the right, when they do reform, people say, well, you guys are paid for by the capitalists. But the parties on the left, when they do the right thing, they can say, well, we're doing, they have more credibility with the people that this is going to ultimately benefit everybody. I mean, so do you also share the view, Kyle, that this, the tax reform is going to get through? I mean, the VAT tax reform?
It's not going to be easy. Maybe you're going to need more discussion with sectors, but I think that at least some of that will progress, which is good. And in parallel, as I mentioned, we have to monitor those two things. One is tax reform advancing, and other, if it's the reforms that we have already approved in the past, they are not going to be undue. So those are two things that will be important. Maybe not for the first year of Lula or second year, because when you establish a very complex reform like that, the first 1 or 2 years you struggle a bit, to get used to that new system. Maybe it's something that will benefit the next president rather than Lula. But I think
if it's not Lula, the next president, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, the main concern, I think in the market about Brazil is how much of the reform that were undertaken over the last few administrations will be undone by basically Lula, who's under pressure from PT. At the end of the day, I still remember when he first became president, people said, wow, this guy is a leader of the union, what does he know, that kind of thing, that he was viewed as an extreme left-winger, who just wanted to basically destroy capitalism. He turned out very different in his first term, because precisely, apparently, not only has got a lot of charisma, he's a pretty smart guy at the end of the day. He's a pragmatist. So how much of this, of the reforms that have been done, you think are now at risk of being undone under Lula?
I think that it's very unlikely that those reforms will be undone. We hear a lot of noise in Brazil. We will keep hearing them, even coming from Lula himself. I mean, he talks to his audience, he talks to his voters. So he says, well, Bolsonaro's government sold Eletrobras for banana price, let's undo that, that's not fair. But he doesn't order his government to do anything real about it. So there's a lot of noise, but at the end, he decides in a pragmatic way, and he knows that he cannot do undo those reforms. That would be bad for economy. The other thing I think it's important to say is that even though we have a lot of inner dispute in Lula's government, we have PT speaking out loud, try to bring the government through a more developmentalistic politics in economy. In those 100 days of government this year, Lula always gave Haddad a victory. Maybe not in his first day, on January 1st, he decided not to re-tax fuels, but after a few months, he decided to do that because Haddad said, hey, Mr. President, we need that money for our fiscal consolidation. So he did that. Even though inflation, fuel inflation got a bit higher, that is not good for popularity, but he decided to do that.
Let's just assume for the time being that, we give Lula the benefit of the doubt. Let's just assume that this guy is larger than life president of Brazil. There's a reason why this guy has had a very long and successful political career because of who he is, as opposed to his party, right? And his party needs him. His party needs him much more than he needs his party. Let's put it that way, right? Let's assume he does not basically spoil things by undoing the reforms. Now, let's assume that the VAT reform gets done this year. Now, at what point do you say, well, listen, because over the last 20 years, you think about China was growing at 10%, and then now, like, India is growing at 8%, the fastest growing economy in the world, right? Russia was doing quite well, by the way. I mean, from that point of view, like, Brazil has always been a lagger for a lot of reasons, right? It's the largest economy in Latin America. It's a great country. We have the best football, basically, teams in the world. But somehow, it just never managed to grow. And you think, well, it's because, because all these problems. But these problems, one after another, have been dealt with through a sequence of reforms. At what point can we actually see those results coming through?
Well, in fact, as Kyle just mentioned, we were seeing some results. Talking about growth, for example, in the last 2 years, Brazil grew 8%, which is really rare when we look at our recent past. Our capital markets are really bigger nowadays. But the main problem, I don't believe that Lula will undo the reforms. Not because he's pragmatic, but he has a minority government in Congress. He doesn't have the votes. So the point here is that looking at the end of the last year, when we approved the constitutional amendment, increasing the public expenditure in 2% of GDP, basically undoing the impacts of the former fiscal rule, that put our debt to GDP in a path that will be really tough to stabilize. I don't believe that they will be stabilized. The good news, markets doesn't care about it nowadays, so no one gives a shit. I'm talking to anyone here in New York and DC, and people say, okay, you have 75 debt to GDP. Nowadays, if you go to 90% in 4 years, there's no problem to me. That said, I believe that we are moving to a new equilibrium where with higher expenditure, public expenditure, we will live in an environment with higher interest rates.
Right now, maybe Lula is sort of like, it's a bit of a honeymoon thing. The Brazilian economy is still doing pretty well. When things are doing well, you can get away with not doing anything that you promise your voters. It's when the economy starts to slow. Maybe later this year, as a result, as you said, the fiscal impulse is going to turn more neutral. Yeah. Monetary policy become more restrictive, a strong currency, and in the global environment, that's when I think the real test for Lula probably is going to be when things are not going so well.
Yeah, right. I think that this is the pudding test for any politician. Yeah. We have to go through good times and bad times. Going forward, this time around, things will be probably a little bit more difficult. Although I agree with you that we have reforms that are paying off, we have a Minister of Finance now that is trying to do the good thing, and probably the global economy, we never know, but probably the global economy will not be as good as it was during Lula's first mandate, but probably not bad. High commodities, China coming back, interest rates in the US stabilizing. I was talking to a US economist just before we started this talk, and he said, I have bad news for you. The US economy is going to enter into recession. And I said, for Brazil, it really doesn't matter. We are not connected to the US economy. It's going to be good news because you're going to stop hiking rates and maybe start cutting rates. And for us, it is good. So in that sense, China is more important than the US for Brazil.
And Lula likes to brag himself for being a lucky guy. That's something that he does. And it's actually happening again. It happened on his first term. It's happening again. I mean, foreign affairs are helping him now. China is helping, commodities helping. Even Fed not having to hike too much his interest rates is helping Brazil. I
don't want to say I'm an optimist when it comes to Brazil, though I'm probably more optimistic than you are. But we have to also realize that, you know what, when it comes to fiscal discipline, I mean, literally you have to look very hard to find any country that's practicing fiscal discipline. U.S. budget deficit this year, it's about 5.5% of GDP, UK is 7%. Like the fiscal picture is absolutely spiraling out of control. In pretty much most countries, the turning point comes when growth starts to slow, right? And then inflation is still relatively high. So you can basically cut interest rates more aggressively, and then your real interest rates just go through the roof, and then your debt situation, so on and so forth. But I think one thing Brazil does have going for itself is the fact that it's now running current account surplus. So which means that even if we're to resort to cutting interest rates aggressively, you're not going to see a collapse in basically the currency that will become inflationary, that basically make it more difficult for them to actually use policy. So I think from that point of view, you could argue that that the currency could provide a little bit of buffer because you're running current account surplus. So currency, if you let the currency go down 10%, you're going to bring a bit of inflation, which is going to help you basically make the debt situation look better optically speaking. At the same time, basically help lower interest rates, real interest rates. So that's an option. I mean, a lot of countries don't have that option, by the way.
Exchange rate today is 4.9, and exchange rate was 4.9 in June 2020 when the Selic rate was 2. What happened to Brazilian currency is that during the pandemics, we can massively, as all other currencies in the world, but in the month following the reaction and the recovery, during 2020 already, most of the currencies come closer to or close to the pre-pandemic levels, but Brazilian real remained like 25-30% weaker than pre-pandemic levels until these days, in both nominal and real terms, because inflation was high all over the world. So in real terms and nominal terms were relatively similar. So the real is still at weak levels if we take into consideration the current account and terms of trade, commodities. So I believe that rates won't be too correlated to the effects going forward. I think that we have two scenarios. A scenario where the Selic rate goes down and the currency actually strengthen. That happened many times in the past, and actually is happening those days, which is a scenario where things are doing right. So considering that BRL is at a weak level, if things go right, interest rates will go down, and the BRL will strengthen.
Circle, basically.
Exactly. So that's what we call in Brazil is the Brazil kit. So the Brazil kit goes up. It goes up. The combo, the Brazil combo goes up. There's another scenario where interest rates go down, but not because of technical reason, but because of political reason. If that happens, then one of the pillars, and then I agree with him, one of the pillars of the currency credibility would follow, and then we'll go. I'll have to take care on that, but we go close or closer to a Turkish scenario. So if this is the case, then it's going to be a problem. But if interest rates go down because things are doing right, then the currency may strengthen. We are still, the jury is still out on that front.
How bad is it? Because now the Bolsonaro is not even in Brazil anymore. To what extent do you think that this is really bad? Because I know a lot of Brazilians think this has never been worse. Do you think, as a political analyst, would you think it has a potential to become even worse? How real is this, basically, this polarization?
I think that right now it's a little bit better than it was last year or in the beginning of this year. By the way, Bolsonaro is back in Brazil, but he's a bit low profile because he's facing a lot of judiciary problems, such as the jewelry they brought from Saudi Arabia. Other investigations about fake news, and they're for every taste there. I think that if Lula's government succeeds, if he is able to deliver growth and jobs and people start eating picanha again, I think that the polarization will probably go down. I think that Bolsonaro, the right, the extreme right won't get too strong in 2026. If that doesn't happen, if Genta scenario gets real, I think that it will probably bring polarization back again. And maybe the main character won't be Bolsonaro himself, because he probably won't be eligible in 2026 because of those investigations, but someone from that field will compete to Lula, probably Lula again.
My view is that this polarization and will continue and will increase throughout the year because we are going to see the economy really losing steam. So that the temperature on the political field and on the economy will also tend to increase. So in that front, I think that it will be a very important, key test for the government to see if they really will continue to, support the views of a more, say, balanced economic policy, or will do a populist shift.
I forecast a déjà vu feeling through this year, so I believe that we will suffer from lack of growth and all the I fully agree with Caio. So I believe that trying to depart from consensus, I believe that it will be a year where central bank will not be allowed to cut rates. I cannot see the conditions. Inflation will be higher, inflation expectation will be unanchored. Everything else that you can imagine, it will not be possible to cut.
I think we do have a positive path. I think we will have the fiscal framework approved. I think we will probably have the tax reform approved. I think that plus the external factors will allow the BCB to start cutting rates. So I think that we'll have a better end of the year than we have now. I think that polarization also the temperature will low down a bit about that.
Thank you guys. This was amazing. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience learned a lot, and I really appreciate your candor. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you very
David.
much.